The smell was the first thing to tell you that God had turned his back on Savannah that morning. Not the grand, cleansing scent of a forest fire, but a foul, intimate perfume of destruction. It was the smell of burnt pine and horsehair plaster, of scorched silk and boiled varnish, and underneath it all, a greasy, sweetish odor that clung to the back of the throat and spoke of things that should never be rendered by flame. The humid August air, already thick enough to drink, did not disperse it but held it close. A shroud of foul air draped over the manicured squares and beneath the weeping veils of Spanish moss. City Marshal Silas Blackwood felt it long before he saw the ruin on Broughton Street. He tasted it in his morning chicory, a bitter premonition. The summons had been terse, delivered by a boy whose eyes were too wide for his face. "It's the Monroe house, Marshal. A fire." And something else. Something else. In Savannah, in the year of our Lord 1852, that could mean anything. A duel over a lady's honor. A factor's ruinous gamble on the cotton market. A cholera outbreak creeping up from the docks. But the boy's terror had a different quality, a note of violation that went beyond the tidy categories of civic misfortune. He turned the corner, and the scene solidified from the haze. The Monroe residence, or what was left of it, stood like a blackened jawbone against the bruised dawn sky. Two of its proud Ionic columns had collapsed, lying like felled giants in the manicured garden, now a trampled mess of ash and soot-stained jasmine. The fine Georgian brick was scorched to the color of dried blood. Hoses still wept sluggishly onto the smoldering timbers, and the air hissed with the sound of water meeting heat. A crowd of onlookers, a grim tapestry of white faces, stood at a respectful distance, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. The city's enslaved, on their morning errands, moved past with averted eyes, their faces impassive masks that betrayed nothing. They knew better than to be curious about the tragedies of their masters. Elias Monroe stood on the opposite side of the street, a statue of a man carved from shock. His fine linen shirt was streaked with soot, his face a mask of disbelief. He was a factor, a king of the cotton exchange, a man who measured his world in bales and ledgers. His life was a fortress of order and profit. This was chaos, a line item for which there was no column. His wife, Catherine, was not with him. She had been taken, they said, to a neighbor's house, where her shrieks had finally dissolved into a laudanum-induced stupor. Blackwood tipped his hat, a gesture that felt absurdly inadequate. "Mr. Monroe, a terrible business." Monroe's eyes, the color of cold river water, found his. They were not filled with grief, not yet. They were filled with a terrifying, incandescent rage. "They are dead, Marshal, my children, both of them." He said it not as a lament, but as an accusation. "Burned. In their beds." Blackwood felt a cold stone settle in his gut. He had seen death in all its squalid variety. The fever wasted, the knife slain, the river drowned. But this was different. This was a violation of the natural order, an attack on the very concept of innocence. "Thomas and little Eleanor?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "They were 7 and 5, Monroe said, his voice cracking like dry timber. "She locked the door, from the outside. She used the master key." The pronoun hung in the air, heavy and singular. Blackwood didn't have to ask. The whispers from the crowd had already supplied the name, a single syllable repeated over and over, a venomous chant. "Lucy." "The girl?" Blackwood asked, needing the confirmation. "My wife's personal maid. The nursery girl." Monroe's face contorted, the grief finally breaking through the rage like a fissure in stone. "A creature we took in, fed, clothed. We treated her like... He couldn't finish the sentence. The lie was too great, even for a man in his state. "Where is she now?" "Gone," Monroe spat. "Vanished. Slipped away into the night like the serpent she is. Find her, Marshal. Find her and bring her back. I want to see her hang. I want to watch the life drain from her eyes. It's the only thing left that will give me peace." Blackwood looked from Monroe's ravaged face to the skeletal ruin of his home. Peace. He doubted that word would ever again have meaning in this place. He stepped over a fallen piece of cornice. The carved acanthus leaves sharp and cruel under his boot, and walked toward the heart of the darkness. The air grew hotter, thick with the stench of finality. He was not just a city marshal anymore. He was an investigator of an impossible crime, a reader of ashes, a hunter of a ghost who, just hours before, had been a 16-year-old slave girl named Lucy. He had to piece together the anatomy of a monster. But as he looked up at the gaping, blackened window of the children's second-floor bedroom, a single, chilling thought took root in his mind. What if the monster wasn't the one who lit the match, but the one who created her? The name Lucy was a ghost on the city's tongue before the sun was fully clear of the horizon. It was a name whispered in kitchens and parlors, on the docks and along the shaded promenades of the city's squares. For the white citizens of Savannah, it became a synonym for demonic ingratitude, a cautionary tale of the serpent they nurtured at their breast. For the enslaved, it was a name spoken in hushed tones, or not at all, a name that carried the terrifying weight of retribution. It was a thunderclap that promised a lightning strike upon them all. Marshal Blackwood's office was a small, cluttered room smelling of stale tobacco, ink, and the damp that perpetually crept up from the city's marshy foundations. Here he began his ledger of the crime, the neat columns and cursive script, a paltry defense against the chaos of the event. He was a methodical man in a city that ran on passion and pride. He believed in facts, in timelines, in the slow accretion of details that would eventually reveal a truth as solid and irrefutable as a brick wall. His first interviews were with the Monroes, household staff, the enslaved men and women who were now quartered in the carriage house, their faces etched with a fear that was deeper than grief. They were witnesses and, in the eyes of the law and their master, potential accomplices. He started with Alara, the cook. She was an older woman, her face a road map of sorrows, her hands gnarled from decades of work over hot stoves. She sat on a small stool before him, her back ramrod straight, her eyes fixed on a point just over his shoulder. "Tell me about Lucy," Blackwood began, his voice softer than he used with most. "Ain't much to tell, sir," Alara said, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to absorb the light in the room. "She came to us 2 years ago. From a rice plantation up the river. Mr. Monroe bought her for the mistress." "What was she like?" A flicker of something, wary affection, perhaps, crossed her face before being suppressed. Quiet, kept to herself, good with her hands, could mend lace like a spider weaves a web. The mistress liked that. The mistress, Catherine Monroe. Blackwood had seen her at socials. A woman of brittle beauty and nervous energy, her laughter like the tinkling of ice in a glass, a little too sharp, a little too cold. Was she fond of the children? This time, the pause was longer. "She was their nursemaid, sir. She did her duty. She fed them, bathed them, sang them to sleep." "But was she fond of them?" Blackwood pressed gently. Alara's gaze finally met his. Her eyes were dark and deep, and in them he saw a universe of unspoken truths. "Fondness is a luxury, Marshal, a thing you can afford when you own your own heart. Lucy, she did her work." He knew he was walking on a tightrope. To get any truth from these people, he needed a semblance of trust, but the chasm of race and power between them was too vast to be bridged by a few soft-spoken questions. Any word they said could be twisted, used against them, against their families. Silence was their shield, and vagueness their armor. Did she seem troubled? Angry? "We all troubled, Marshal," Alara said, the corner of her mouth twitching in what might have been a smile or a grimace. "It's the condition of our lives. But angry? No more than the rest of us. She kept her anger where she kept everything else, tucked away deep inside. He learned little more. Lucy had no family to speak of, sold away long ago. She rarely spoke of her past. She was a skilled seamstress. She could be gentle with little Eleanor's hair. She had a way of standing perfectly still that could unnerve the mistress. Small, disconnected fragments, not the portrait of a monster. His interview with Elias Monroe, conducted later that day in the borrowed study of a sympathetic neighbor, was entirely different. Monroe had fortified himself with brandy, and the fiery spirit had burned away his shock, leaving only a pure, distilled rage. She was sullen, Monroe said, pacing before a grand mahogany desk. My wife remarked on it often, a kind of insolence in her quietness. You'd speak to her, and she'd look at you with those eyes of hers, large, dark eyes, not defiant, not exactly, but assessing, as if she were weighing you on some scale, only she could see. It was unnerving. Did you ever have cause to punish her? Monroe stopped his pacing and glared at Blackwood. She was my property, Marshal, as was my right. Catherine, my wife, is a delicate woman. Her nerves are easily frayed. If the girl was disobedient or lazy, she was corrected. It is the only way to maintain order. And what form did these corrections take? The usual, Monroe said dismissively, waving a hand. A switching, withholding of privileges. Last winter, she was quite insolent, and Catherine had her confined to the storage cellar for a day. It was damp, but hardly a torture chamber. Blackwood made a note. A damp cellar in a Savannah winter. Not torture, perhaps, but a cold misery designed to break the spirit. Tell me about the key, Blackwood said, shifting the subject. The master key to the upstairs bedrooms. I keep it on my dressing table, Monroe said. It's always there. She must have crept in while we slept and taken it. The cunning of these people is diabolical. Blackwood thought of a 16-year-old girl slipping like a shadow into the sanctum of her master's bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs, to steal the instrument of her terrible plan. It suggested a level of premeditation that was profoundly chilling. Was there any specific incident, a catalyst, something that happened in the last few days that might have pushed her to this? Monroe stared into his brandy snifter, as if seeking an answer in its amber depths. Nothing out of the ordinary. Catherine was displeased with her yesterday. Something about a torn dress on Eleanor's favorite doll. She told the girl she was worthless, that she had paid far too much for such a clumsy, useless creature. But heavens, man, that's hardly a provocation for this abomination. No, Blackwood thought, it wasn't, which meant the cause was not a single event, but an accumulation. A slow filling of a well of despair, until one final drop caused it to overflow in a torrent of fire. He left Monroe and walked through the city squares, the late afternoon sun casting long Gothic shadows from the live oaks. The Spanish moss, which he had always found beautiful, now seemed like gray skeletal fingers, reaching, grasping. It was a suffocating beauty, parasitic. It thrived by strangling its host. He began to build a picture of Lucy in his mind, not from the testimony, but from the spaces between the words. A quiet girl from a rice plantation, a place of back-breaking labor under a merciless sun, brought to the city, to a fine house which might have seemed a salvation. But a plantation was a place of straightforward brutality. A city house, under a mistress like Catherine Monroe, offered a more intimate, more psychological cruelty. The constant scrutiny, the whims and moods of a bored, unhappy woman, the demand not just for labor but for a performance of contentment. He imagined Lucy mending a doll's dress, her fingers nimble, her mind elsewhere. He imagined Catherine's sharp, cutting words, chipping away at whatever was left of the girl's soul, worthless, clumsy, useless. Words that could burn hotter than any flame. That evening he found a witness, a watchman, who had been on patrol 2 blocks away from the Monroe house. The man remembered something from the hour before the fire alarm was raised. "It was the mockingbird, Marshal," the watchman said, scratching his whiskered chin. "There's one that nests in the big magnolia near the Monroe's garden. Sings all night sometimes, drives a man mad. But last night, it was different." "Different how?" "It was singing a tune I'd never heard before. Not its usual mix of robin and wren and whatnot. It was a strange sort of melody. A sad, slow tune. Almost like a lullaby. But a broken one. It kept singing it over and over. And then, it just stopped. A few minutes later, I saw the glow in the sky. A broken lullaby." The image stayed with Blackwood as he tried to sleep that night. He saw a girl, no older than his own niece, standing in the dark, listening to a bird's strange song. He saw her turn toward the house, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He saw her holding a key, the cold brass a promise of warmth to come. He was hunting a monster, but the picture forming in his mind was that of a child, and that was far more terrifying. The heat of the following days was a physical presence, a weight on the chest that made every breath a conscious effort. It mirrored the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the city. The manhunt for Lucy was in full cry. Slave patrols, bolstered by volunteers with scores to settle, and a thirst for blood, scoured the swamps and pine barrens outside the city. Bloodhounds, their baying a mournful counterpoint to the drone of cicadas, were brought in, their noses to the ground, where a single, small footprint had been found in the soft earth of the Monroe's ruined garden. The trail went cold at the edge of the Savannah River, as if she had simply dissolved into the murky water. Marshal Blackwood, however, focused his search not on the swamps, but on the labyrinthine corridors of the past. He knew the why was as important as the where. The act was monstrous, but the motive was the key that might unlock the true nature of the tragedy. He felt, with a certainty that disturbed him, that to condemn Lucy as a simple demon was to let everyone else, the entire society that had forged her, escape their complicity. He paid a visit to the ruins. The fire was out, now, leaving a silence that was more profound than any scream. The stench remained, a permanent resident. He made his way carefully through the debris of the ground floor, past the ghost of a grand piano, its strings curled like burnt nerves, past the shattered remains of fine porcelain. He climbed the treacherous, half-burned staircase to the second floor. The master bedroom was a wreck of charred furniture and melted glass. On the floor near where the dressing table would have been, he saw a faint, dark stain on the floorboards. It looked like spilled ink, or perhaps oil from a lamp. He knelt, touching the greasy residue. It was lamp oil, turpentine, mixed in to make it burn hotter, faster. This was not a crime of passion. This was a plan. He crossed the hall to the children's room. Here, the destruction was absolute. The fire had been hottest here, funneled by the closed door. The four-eye ceiling was gone, open to the sky. The small beds were little more than scorched iron frames. It was a place of ultimate horror, and he felt a wave of nausea. He forced himself to look, to be the methodical observer. The door, or what was left of it, hung on one hinge. He examined the lock. It was a heavy brass box lock, the kind common in these grand houses. The keyhole was on the outside. Monroe was right. It had been locked from the hall. And then he saw it. On the floor, just outside the doorway, almost hidden by a piece of fallen plaster, was a small object. He picked it up. It was a whittled bird, crudely carved from a piece of cypress, its wings half spread. It was small enough to fit in the palm of a child's hand. He recognized it. Thomas Monroe had carried it everywhere. A gift, the boy had once proudly told him in the market, from Lucy. She had carved it for him. Blackwood stood there, the little bird in his hand, a cold dread washing over him. Why would a girl, bent on such a heinous act of murder against a child, leave his favorite toy just outside the door? Was it a last-second pang of conscience? A token of a love that had curdled into hate? Or was it something else? A marker? A sign? It didn't fit the narrative of a cold-blooded monster. Monsters didn't leave mementos. His investigation led him next to the slave markets, to the auctioneers and traders who dealt in human flesh as Monroe dealt in cotton. He was looking for the man who had sold Lucy to Elias Monroe 2 years prior. He found him, a portly, sweat-stained man named Jedediah Fitch, whose records were surprisingly meticulous. "Ah, yes, the girl Lucy," Fitch said, running a thick finger down a ledger. "Lot 42. From the Abernathy Estate Auction. Prime girl. 16. Strong, good teeth. Marked as a skilled seamstress and nursery maid. Abernathy was rice planter. Drove his people hard, but he was fair, as the term goes. Didn't split up families if he could help it." "Did Lucy have family?" Blackwood asked. "She did," Fitch said, turning a page. "A mother, name of Hester. A brother, Samuel. They were sold as a lot, to a plantation down in the Georgia cane country. Monroe, he only wanted the girl. Said he had no need for a field hand. And an older woman. Got her for a good price on account of splitting the lot." Blackwood felt the pieces click into place. He saw it now, a young girl, torn from her mother and brother on an auction block. Her entire world erased in the space of a gavel's fall. Sent alone to a strange city, to a house ruled by a neurotic mistress, to care for children who were a constant, painful reminder of the family she had lost. This wasn't just an inciting incident. This was the foundational wound. He began to construct a new timeline, a psychological one. 2 years of quiet servitude, of swallowing grief and rage. 2 years of mending other people's clothes, of rocking other people's children to sleep, singing them the lullabies her own mother had sung to her. Every act of tenderness a betrayal of her own broken heart, every smile a mask, every quiet moment a chance for the poison to steep. He returned to speak with Elara, the cook. This time he didn't ask about the crime. He brought her a small sack of fresh coffee, a luxury, and sat with her in the shade of the carriage house. He spoke of the weather, of the fever season, of anything but the fire. Finally, when a fragile trust had been woven in the quiet space between them, he asked, "Elara, did Lucy ever speak of her family?" The old woman's eyes filled with a slow, painful sadness. "Every day," she whispered, not with her mouth, with her eyes. "Every time she looked at little Eleanor, I saw it. She was looking for her brother's face. Every time the mistress raised her voice, I saw her flinch, thinking of her mother. That house wasn't a home for her, Marshall. It was a graveyard filled with living ghosts." She told him of the mockingbird. Lucy loved that bird. She said it was a thief, but a beautiful one. It stole songs from all the other birds and made them its own. She'd leave out breadcrumbs for it. She said the bird was like her. It had no song of its own, only the songs it was forced to learn from others. "And the lullaby?" Blackwood asked, remembering the watchman's story. "The strange song the bird was singing?" "That was her mother's song," Elara said, her voice barely audible. "She used to hum it sometimes, when she thought no one was listening. A tune from the old country," she said. "A song about a river that carries you home. A broken lullaby, a song about going home. Sung by a bird just before the fire." It was a poem, a dark and terrible poem, and Blackwood was beginning to understand its verses. He learned of the final cruelty, the one Elias Monroe had so casually dismissed. The doll with the torn dress. Elara filled in the details. The doll had belonged to Catherine Monroe as a child. It was a precious, porcelain thing. Eleanor, in a fit of pique, had torn its lace gown. Catherine had not blamed her daughter. She had blamed Lucy. "She didn't just scold her, Marshall," Ilara recounted, her voice trembling with a remembered fury. "She took Lucy's hands, the ones that could sew so fine, and she beat them with the back of a silver hairbrush. Told her they were wicked, useless hands. She said, I should have them cut off. You are nothing but property, and I have the right to damage my property as I see fit." She said it right in front of the children. Little Thomas, Ilara said, had started to cry. He'd told his mother to stop, that it was his sister's fault. Catherine had sent him from the room. But later, Thomas had found Lucy in the scullery, hiding her bruised and swollen hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. He had approached her, his face a mask of childish confusion and guilt, and he had repeated what he had heard his mother say so many times. "Don't cry, Lucy," the boy had said, his voice earnest, trying to offer what he thought was comfort. "You're just a slave. It doesn't matter if you hurt. It doesn't matter if you hurt." There it was, the final drop of poison, not from a place of malice, but from a place of learned innocence. The child, mimicking the casual cruelty of his world, had delivered the verdict on her entire existence. Her pain did not matter. Her life did not matter. She was a thing. And what does one do with a thing that feels an agony that no one else will acknowledge? Blackwood saw the rest of the day unfold in his mind's eye with sickening clarity. Lucy, her hands throbbing, her soul shattered, moving through the motions of her evening chores, serving dinner to the family whose casual pronouncements had just annihilated her, putting the children to bed, their innocent faces a final, unbearable torment. The boy's words echoing in the silent corridors of her mind. Matter if you hurt, she proved them wrong. She would create a hurt so immense, so unimaginable, that it would have to matter. It would be written in smoke and ash across the Savannah sky. It would become a legend. She would make her pain real by transforming it into their inferno. He understood now. He was not hunting a monster. He was hunting a girl who had been pushed past the farthest edge of human endurance. A girl who had decided that if she was to be a ghost in their world, she would become a specter of vengeance that would haunt them forever. The little carved bird outside the door was not a token of affection. It was an epitaph. It was a symbol of the one, small, beautiful thing her hands had created in that house, left outside the realm of the fire. It was her signature on the masterpiece of her despair. And the key she stole was not just a key to a room. It was the key to her escape, not from the house, but from the prison of her own silent suffering. The night air was a suffocating blanket woven from jasmine and decay. Lucy moved through the sleeping house, a wraith in a borrowed chemise. She was no longer a girl. The thing that had been Lucy, the quiet, watchful girl who could mend lace and hum her mother's lullabies, had been burned away in the crucible of that afternoon. What remained was something elemental, a being of pure, cold purpose. Her bare feet made no sound on the polished heart pine floors. The house, usually a symphony of creaks and groans, seemed to hold its breath. Even the grandfather clock in the hall, a relentless tyrant of time, seemed to have paused its swinging pendulum. In this moment, time did not belong to the master. It belonged to her. Her hands, bruised and swollen from Catherine's silver-backed brush, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pain. Each pulse was a reminder. Nopper more, nopper more, nopper more, useless hands. Wicked hands. She looked at them in the sliver of moonlight slanting through the window. They would not be useless tonight. They would be instruments. First, the master's room. She slipped inside, a ghost of a whisper. Elias and Catherine Monroe slept, oblivious, in their grand four-poster bed. The scent of stale brandy and lavender water hung in the air. On his dressing table, amongst the clutter of cuff-links and collar stays, lay the ring of keys. Her fingers, trembling only slightly, closed around the cold brass. She singled out the one she needed, the master key for the second-floor bedrooms. Its teeth were sharp, like a promise. Next, the storeroom off the kitchen, the turpentine, the lamp oil. She poured them into a pewter pitcher, the liquids swirling together, a volatile potion. The smell was sharp and clean, a scent of erasure. It would wash away the cloying sweetness of this house, the lingering perfume of her misery. She climbed the stairs, her heart a cold, steady drum. Not the frantic beat of fear, but the measured cadence of a ritual. She passed the room where she slept, a small, airless closet off the main hall, with its thin pallet and its single, high window barred like a cell. She did not even glance at it. It had never been hers. She reached the children's door. For a moment, she paused, her hand on the cool porcelain knob. A sound came from within. Eleanor, the little girl, murmuring in her sleep, a soft, feathery sound. For a heartbeat, a different life flickered in Lucy's mind, a life where she could have loved these children, where their innocence was not a weapon used against her, but that life was a phantom, a story from a book she was not allowed to read. The memory of a small boy's voice, earnest and damning, snuffed it out. "It doesn't matter if you hurt." She did not open the door. She moved to the side, her back pressed against the Branagh's floral wallpaper. She uncorked the pitcher and began to pour the oil in a thick, dark line along the bottom of the door, watching it seep into the space between the wood and the floor. It soaked into the hall runner, creating a dark, spreading stain. A fuse. Then she stood and inserted the key into the lock. The brass felt heavy, ancient. A key was a thing of power. It could confine or release. The masters used keys to lock things away, their silver, their liquor, their people. Tonight, she would use their own instrument of control against them. The lock turned with a soft, oiled click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. A final, irrevocable sound. She walked back down the hall, trailing the oil behind her, a glistening umbilical cord connecting the children's room to the top of the grand staircase. There, she paused. She could hear the mockingbird outside, singing its strange, stolen song, her mother's lullaby. "A river to carry you home." The bird fell silent. It was time. She retrieved the tinderbox from the kitchen hearth. The flint scraped against the steel, a sound like grinding teeth. A spark bloomed, a tiny, defiant star in the darkness. She touched it to the oil-soaked rag she had prepared. The flame caught with a hungry whoosh. For a moment, she held it, a small, dancing demon in the palm of her hand. It was beautiful. It was alive. It was the only warmth she had felt in this house that did not come from a stove or a hearth. This was a warmth she had made herself. She dropped the burning rag onto the end of the oily trail. The effect was instantaneous. A line of fire shot down the hallway, a racing serpent of blue and orange light. It moved faster than a man could run, a river of flame flowing toward its source. When it reached the children's door, it pooled and flared, licking up the wood with an eager roar. The smoke came first, thick and acrid. Then the heat, a sudden, blasting wave. The sleeping house awoke with a scream. Not a human scream at first, but the scream of the house itself, the groan of timbers, the crackle of varnish, the sharp pop of glass. Then came the other sounds. A muffled cry from the children's room, a sound of confusion turning to terror, a shout from the master bedroom, the frantic jangling of a doorknob, Elias Monroe's bellow of rage and fear as he found his own door locked from the outside, a simple trick with a wedge of wood she'd jammed under it. They were all locked in their gilded cage. Lucy did not stay to watch. Her work was done. She moved, not in a panic, but with the same deliberate grace she had used all night. Down the back stairs, through the kitchen, and out into the garden. The night air was cool on her hot skin. Behind her, the house was beginning to glow, a monstrous jack-o'-lantern against the dark sky. The first tongues of flame were visible now, chewing through the roof of the nursery wing. She slipped through the garden, the scent of burning pine overwhelming the jasmine. The Spanish moss on the live oaks was illuminated by the fire, dripping from the branches like fiery tears. She reached the back gate, its iron cold beneath her hand. She did not look back. As she melted into the labyrinthine lanes and shadows of Savannah, she could hear the alarm bells begin to clang, a frantic, futile chorus. She could hear the distant shouts, the beginning of a city's panic. But she carried a profound silence within her. She had taken all their noise, all their words, all their casual cruelties, and transformed them into a single, roaring flame. She had made her pain matter. She was no longer Lucy, the slave girl. She was Lucy of the fire. A name that would be whispered in terror and awe. A legend written in ash. A ghost disappearing down a dark road, heading for a river that might, at last, carry her home. The hunt was a fever that gripped Savannah for weeks. It was a brutal, sweeping purge, fueled by fear and a thirst for vengeance. Every rumor was chased down, every whisper investigated. The slave patrols became packs of wolves, descending on the quarters, tearing apart homes and lives in their search for the phantom girl. Men were whipped for information they did not have. Women were threatened for complicity they did not share. The entire enslaved population of Savannah was held under a cloud of collective guilt, their every movement scrutinized, their sullen silence taken as proof of a secret, shared conspiracy. Marshall Blackwood found himself an unwilling participant in this city-wide paroxysm of rage. He rode with the patrols, his presence a flimsy attempt at imposing the rule of law on what was essentially a mob. He saw the faces of the men he rode with, their eyes alight with a grim, righteous pleasure. They were not just hunting a fugitive. They were reasserting an order that had been terrifyingly challenged. They were reminding the enslaved of their place with ropes and leather and the barrels of their guns. The trail led them into the brackish primordial world of the coastal swamps. It was another world, a place where the manicured order of Savannah dissolved into a tangled, lawless mess of cypress knees, sucking mud and black water that mirrored a sky obscured by a dense canopy. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the hum of a million insects. Here, the bloodhounds grew confused, their frantic bays turning to whining frustration as 1,000 scents crossed and recrossed the trail. Runaways had used these swamps for generations, perfecting the art of invisibility. They found signs of her, or what they thought were signs. A scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn bush, a half-eaten piece of stolen fruit. But these were like whispers in a hurricane, small clues that led nowhere. The swamp was an ally to the fugitive. It swallowed sounds, confused scents, and erased footprints. They pushed deeper, into terrain where the horses struggled and the men cursed, their fine boots sinking in the muck. Blackwood felt as if they were chasing a spirit, a asterisk haint that had dissolved into the landscape itself. One afternoon, deep in the morass, they came upon a small, hidden encampment of Maroons, a small community of escaped slaves living a feral, precarious existence. The patrol descended on them with a savage fury. The camp was burned, its inhabitants captured. Under interrogation, a brutal, drawn-out affair that turned Blackwood's stomach. An old man, his body a tapestry of scars, finally spoke of the girl. "She passed this way," he rasped, his voice dry as dust. "3 nights back, just a ghost in the moonlight. Said she was headed for the coast, headed for the water." "Did you help her?" the patrol leader demanded, his whip hand twitching. The old man gave a weary, toothless smile. "The swamp helps those who respects it, Captain." She knew the old ways, knew to walk in the water to hide her scent. knew which roots to eat and which ones would kill you. She wasn't a house girl. She was something else. Something wild that had been caged too long. Headed for the coast. The search shifted, fanning out along the network of barrier islands and tidal creeks that separated Georgia from the vast expanse of the Atlantic. They imagined her stealing a boat, trying to make for the free black settlements in Florida, or hoping to signal a northbound ship. But the coast was a labyrinth, and she was always one step ahead. Sightings were reported. A girl fitting her description, buying passage from a gullah fisherman. A glimpse of a solitary figure on a deserted beach at dusk. But they were always after the fact, like echoes of her passing. Blackwood began to believe she was gone for good. He felt a strange, unsettling mixture of professional failure and private relief. The thought of her capture, of the trial that would be a mere formality, of the public spectacle of her execution, filled him with a profound weariness. He had pieced together the why of her crime, and the knowledge sat like a stone in his soul. To see her hang would not feel like justice. It would feel like the final, ugly act in a tragedy that had begun long before the fire. Back in Savannah, the official narrative had been set in stone. Lucy was a monster, an unnatural fiend. The newspapers, in lurid prose, painted her as a witch, a creature possessed by the devil, an example of the inherent savagery that lurked beneath the placid surface of their bonded servants. The story of her sold-off family, of Catherine Monroe's petty cruelties, of the boy's innocent killing words, none of this was part of the tale. The truth was too complex, too incriminating. It was easier, and far more comforting, to believe in a simple monster. Elias Monroe began to rebuild his house on the same spot, a monument to his defiance. But it was said he was a changed man, haunted and brittle, who drank heavily and started at shadows. Catherine Monroe remained a recluse, her beauty shattered, her nerves permanently destroyed, a prisoner in a neighbor's house, forever trapped in the night of the fire. And Lucy? Lucy became a legend. Her fate remained ambiguous, a blank space in the official record. Some said she was caught and quietly killed by a patrol, her body sunk in the swamp to avoid a trial that might air uncomfortable truths. Others claimed she had made it to a ship, that she was living free in the North, or Canada, or even England, a constant, nagging reminder that the system was not infallible, that its property could, in fact, escape. But a different story took root among the enslaved of Savannah and the Gullah people of the coast. They said Lucy had never left. They said that when she reached the ocean, she had walked into the water and given herself back to it, and that the water had accepted her. They said her spirit now haunted the marshes and the tidal creeks, a vengeful ghost who protected runaways and brought misfortune to cruel masters. They called her the Fire Witch of the Salt Marsh. On moonless nights, they said, you could sometimes see a faint, flickering light out over the water, like a single, hovering ember. And sometimes, when the wind blew in just right from the sea, you could hear the faint strains of a strange lullaby, a sad, broken tune about a river that carries you home. The story of what she did was a horror, but the story of who she became was a prayer. A dark prayer, but a prayer nonetheless. Marshall Blackwood, a man of facts and ledgers, found he preferred the legend to the truth he had uncovered. The legend, at least, offered a kind of justice. The truth offered only pain. Dashel Pug. Namid Epilogue. The year is 1870. The war has come and gone, a great, scouring fire that has left the old world in ashes, and the new one struggling to be born. Savannah has survived, scarred but unbowed, a beautiful widow clinging to the ghosts of her past. The Spanish moss still drips from the live oaks, but now it drapes over a city where the clang of the streetcar mixes with the conversations of free black men and women who walk the shaded squares not as property, but as citizens. The change is seismic. Yet in the quiet parlors and on the shaded verandas, the old ways of thinking cling as tenaciously as the ivy on the brickwork. Silas Blackwood is an old man now. His hair is white, his hands are knotted with arthritis, and he walks with the aid of a cypress cane. The title of city marshal belongs to a younger, harder man, a veteran of the war. Blackwood is a relic, a man whose memories are rooted in an era that most are eager to forget. He often finds himself walking the city's familiar grid, his path dictated by memory rather than destination. On this particular afternoon, a humid day in late summer, his steps lead him, as they often do, to Broughton Street. The Monroe house stands there, rebuilt and grander than before, but it is empty. Elias Monroe died not long after the war, his fortune lost, his spirit broken. No one else has ever lived in the house. It is said to be haunted, a place of profound and lingering sorrow. The garden is overgrown, the paint is peeling, and the windows stare out like vacant eyes. Blackwood stands across the street, leaning on his cane, and looks at the house. Of all the cases in his long career, of all the violence and despair he has witnessed, this is the one that has stayed with him, the fire. The girl. He never spoke of what he learned, of the sold family and the silver-backed hairbrush. Who would have listened, and what good would it have done? He had written his official report. Fugitive slave Lucy, perpetrator of arson and murder, fled and presumed deceased, and closed the book. But he had not closed it in his mind. A woman stops beside him, a black woman of about his own age, her face deeply lined, her eyes clear and knowing. She carries a basket of sweetgrass, woven with an intricate skill. He recognizes her, though he hasn't seen her in years. It is Alara, the Monroes, former cook. She nods at him, a gesture not of deference, but of mutual recognition. "You still thinkin' on it, old man?" she asks, her voice the same low, melodic hum he remembers. "Sometimes," Blackwood admits, "I think on it all the time." "They never found her, you know," Alara says, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "The swamp is deep," he replies, using the old euphemism. Alara smiles, a slow, knowing expression. "The world is deeper, deeper than any swamp." She adjusts the basket on her hip. "People say her ghost is in the salt marsh. But I don't believe in ghosts that rattle chains. I believe in ghosts that live and breathe. I believe in a ghost that found a boat, a ghost that learned a new name, a ghost that raised children of her own and taught them a lullaby about a river." Blackwood looks at her, at the quiet certainty in her eyes. He wants to believe her. He wants to believe in a world where such an escape is possible, where a life can be rebuilt from such complete and utter ruin. "Perhaps," he says, his voice a dry rasp, "I hope you're right." "Don't matter if I'm right," Alara says, turning to leave. "What matters is the story, the one they tell, about the monster, and the one we tell, about the girl who decided her pain was worth something." She walks away, her back straight, disappearing down the street, a figure of quiet, enduring strength. Blackwood is left alone with the silent, brooding house. He looks up at the second-story window, the one that had belonged to the children. In the branches of the great magnolia tree that looms over the garden, a mockingbird has begun to sing. It cycles through its repertoire of stolen melodies, a robin's cheerful call, a sparrow's frantic chirp, a wren's complex trill, a thief of songs. And then, for just a moment, it changes its tune. A new melody emerges, one that Blackwood has not heard in nearly 20 years. A strange, sad, minor key lullaby, haunting and broken. He closes his eyes, listening. The story of Lucy was not a simple question of guilt or innocence, of crime and punishment. He sees that now. It was a story about a world that allows for the ownership of one human by another, a world that builds its mansions on a foundation of human suffering. In such a world, what is the definition of a crime? Where does the boundary lie between an act of murder and an act of war? Her fire was a terrible answer to an even more terrible question. It was the logical conclusion of an illogical system, an act of horror that held up a mirror to the greater, more mundane horror that birthed it. The mockingbird finishes its borrowed, ghostly song and flies away, leaving behind only the rustle of the leaves and the oppressive weight of the Savannah heat. The silence it leaves is not empty. It is filled with the echoes of a name, the memory of a fire, and the